I grew up in the suburbs of a small town called Riverbend, in a house on the edge of a dense forest. My father, a Marine sergeant, was often away, while my mother worked as a librarian in the local library. The library became my second home, where I would spend hours immersed in books. From a young age, I loved nature. My father often took me on hikes through the woods, where we would spend weekends tracking wild animals and learning how to survive in the wilderness. He taught me how to build fires, read animal tracks, and find my way even in the most tangled thickets. It was an unforgettable time. After finishing school, I enrolled in university to study ecology. That's where I met Tom Blackburn. He was born and raised in a small town in the Appalachians. His grandfather was a shaman and taught him everything he knew about nature and spirits. After his parents passed away, Tom moved in with his grandfather, who raised him and passed on his knowledge. We met under rather unusual circumstances. In my first year at university, I joined a nature club that organized hikes and expeditions. One day we went to the forest to study the local flora and fauna. The group consisted of students, each passionate about their field. I lagged behind, trying to photograph a rare bird, and got lost. The sun was already beginning to set, and I started to worry that I wouldn't be able to find my way back. Suddenly, I heard quiet footsteps and turned around. There stood Tom, who, as it turned out, was also a member of the club. He calmly said, "You seem to be lost. Come on, I'll show you the way." He confidently led me through the forest, talking about the local plants and animals. His knowledge and confidence made a great impression on me. On the way, we struck up a conversation and quickly found common ground, discussing our interests. From then on, we became close friends. In the summer of our second year, Tom invited me to spend a couple of weeks in his hometown in the Appalachians. I gladly accepted, as it was a great opportunity to learn more about his life and traditions. We began our journey in Tom's old but reliable pickup truck. The road was long and winding, but the trip was fascinating. We drove through dense forests, small villages, and endless fields. When we finally arrived in his hometown, I was struck by its seclusion and beauty. The town was small, with a population of no more than 200 people. Mostly it consisted of old houses, surrounded by green hills and dense forests. The main street had a few shops, a post office, and a small school. Tom's family was the only Native American family in the town, and they had lived there for several generations. We drove up to Tom's house, which was on the edge of town, near the forest. The house was wooden, 2-story, with a covered porch and a blooming garden. It looked cozy and welcoming, although it was clear it could use a little repair. Tall trees grew around the house, and a small stream flowed nearby. Tom's grandfather met us on the porch. He was a tall and lean old man with a wrinkled face and piercing eyes. His gray hair was braided into a long plait, and he wore a necklace with a bear-tooth amulet. He smiled when he saw us and said he had been waiting for our arrival. "Welcome, Jack," he said, extending his hand to me. "I'm Samuel Blackburn, but you can call me Sam. Tom has told me a lot about you." We went inside the house. Inside it was cozy and warm, with wooden walls and ceilings decorated with old Native American artifacts and family photos. In the center of the living room was a large fireplace, surrounded by soft chairs and a sofa. In the corner stood a bookshelf, among which I noticed many books on ecology and natural science. Sam offered us some tea, and we sat at a large wooden table in the kitchen. He began to tell stories about his youth, the traditions of his people, and how they try to preserve their culture in this small town. Here is one of his stories about the origin of their people. Long ago, at the beginning of human existence, The Warao lived in a beautiful land high above the skies. Besides the Warao, this paradise was inhabited only by birds, which the young men of the tribe hunted. One day, a young man named Okonote was chasing a bird. He shot an arrow, but it missed its target and disappeared. Okonote searched and searched for the arrow and stumbled upon a hole it had fallen into. He looked inside and saw the earth below, a world teeming with herds of wild boars, countless deer, and other animals, unbothered by anyone, roaming green forests and savannas. The hole in the sky was wide enough, and Okonote decided to weave a ladder out of cotton fibers to descend to the ground. Following the hero, all the Indians descended from the sky, and soon they had to regret this adventure. The plumpest woman of the tribe, descending last, completely plugged the hole and deprived her people of the opportunity to return to the promised heavens. Deciding that the risks of a rescue operation were too high, the Warao decided to leave her stuck as she was. I listened attentively to all the old man's legends, sometimes making notes. The days passed peacefully. Gradually, I got to know the town. It was a charming place with quiet streets and friendly residents. A family friend, Joe Williams, often visited the house. He was an old friend of Sam's, with whom he had shared many adventures. He was a massive man with a thick beard and eyes full of life. Joe often dropped by for tea, telling stories about forest expeditions and old times. He was a treasure trove of knowledge about the local flora and fauna. A week passed. Tom and I explored the surroundings and enjoyed nature every day. On Saturday morning, we decided to go back to the forest to spend the whole day there. I woke up early, as the sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon, filling the room with a soft golden light. The house smelled of freshly brewed coffee and herbal tea that Samuel was preparing. Tom was already up, packing backpacks with food and water. "Good morning, Jack," Tom said cheerfully when he saw me in the kitchen. "Today we're going to an old hunting camp my grandfather found." We quickly had breakfast, thanked Sam for his care, and left the house. The morning was cool but sunny, and the forest seemed to come alive around us. Birds sang their morning songs, and the air was fresh and clean. We walked along a path that led deep into the forest. Dry leaves crunched underfoot, and the scent of pine and wild mint filled the air. Tom told me stories about the places we passed through and how his grandfather used them for hunting and shamanic rituals. The forest was full of life. We saw squirrels running along tree branches and heard the distant tapping of a woodpecker. After we had walked a few miles, the trail narrowed, and the trees around us began to thicken. Suddenly, Tom stopped and raised his hand, pointing ahead. I looked in that direction and saw two men holding rifles. Tom said they were the Hanson brothers, Bob and Jim. They looked grim, their faces stern and eyes wary. Bob, the older of the two, with a sturdy build and rough features, was carefully scanning the surroundings. Jim, slightly less muscular but still intimidating, held his rifle at the ready. "Hey, Big Chief, what brings you out here so early?" Bob asked in a gruff voice, not lowering his rifle. "Good morning, Bob, Jim," Tom replied, trying to speak calmly. "We just decided to take a walk in the forest. I hope we're not disturbing your hunting route?" "Watch where you're going," Jim said, his voice tense. "And don't get underfoot." Tom and I exchanged glances, understanding that it was best to keep our distance. Their aggressive behavior and sullen demeanor were not reassuring. Tom nodded to them and we continued on our way, trying not to show our concern. When we were a safe distance away, I asked Tom, "What's wrong with them? Why are they so tense?" "The Hanson brothers have always been like that," Tom replied. "They love hunting and don't have much respect for others. The best we can do is stay away from them." We were about to leave when we heard one of the brothers shout. Bob was yelling to Jim that he had found something interesting. Intrigued, we moved closer and saw that they had discovered the entrance to a den under a large tree. The entrance was surrounded by roots, forming a natural barrier. A strange blue smoke was slowly rising from the den and dissipating into the air. We couldn't understand what this smoke was or where it was coming from. The brothers were excited about their discovery. Bob took a long stick and started poking into the hole. At that moment, we heard a terrifying roar, and a huge bear emerged from the den. She attacked the brothers furiously, defending her territory. Tom and I stood in shock, not knowing what to do. Bob, wasting no time, shot his rifle. The bear roared in pain, but did not retreat. Jim joined his brother, and a hail of bullets rained down on the animal. After several shots, the bear fell dead. The brothers stood, shocked by their deed, looking at the dead bear. A few moments of silence passed when suddenly another roar came from the den. This sound was even more frightening and chilling. Something emerged from the dark entrance, holding 2 small bear cubs. We didn't have time to see what it was, but it looked horrifying. Its eyes burned with fury and pain. The creature gave us a furious look and in just a few moments disappeared into the dense foliage of the forest. We stood in shock, unable to move, realizing that we had just witnessed something completely incredible and terrifying. Soon we came to our senses, and the brothers began to realize what they had done. According to state laws, killing a bear with cubs was punishable by a large fine and sometimes imprisonment. They stood over the body when Tom ran up to them and began scolding them for what they had done. But the brothers were silent, and instead of answering, they pointed their rifles at us. Tom was scared and, trying to calm the situation, said, "Guys, what are you doing? Calm down." Jim replied coldly, "No witnesses, no problems, Big Chief." Tom took a couple of steps back, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. "Wait," Tom said. "We won't tell anyone." The brothers looked at him, and the older one, Bob, with a threatening expression, said, "Okay, we'll let you go, but if we have any problems, I know where you live and where your grandfather lives." His words sounded like a death threat. Bob looked at us, holding his rifle at the ready, and said, "Now get lost." We didn't argue and quickly left. What the brothers did with the bear's body, we didn't know and didn't want to know. This shocking experience left us completely confused and scared. We decided to go back home. The path through the forest seemed endless, and the silence between us was heavy and tense. When we reached the house, Samuel met us at the door. Seeing our pale faces, he knew something had happened, but we didn't say anything. "Are you okay, guys?" Samuel asked, his piercing eyes looking straight at us. "Yes, just tired," Tom replied, trying to hide the fear in his voice. Samuel didn't press, but I knew he sensed something was wrong. We spent the rest of the day in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. In the evening, Tom and I sat on the porch watching the setting sun and trying to make sense of what had happened. A day passed, and the tension didn't leave us. But everything changed when one terrifying incident occurred. The day after the incident, we decided to go back to the forest. The mood was somber, but we knew a walk would help us clear our minds. After wandering through the forest for several hours, we began to feel a bit better. We enjoyed the sounds of nature, watched the birds, and made our way through thick undergrowth. When the sun started to set, we decided to head home. The trail we were on was familiar but still mysterious in the evening light. We walked in silence, enjoying the last moments of our journey, when suddenly we heard a crunch and rustling in the bushes. We tensed, freezing in place. Suddenly, something jumped out of the bushes and knocked Tom to the ground. I was terrified and rushed to help him. It was the creature we had seen before, but now it was even more furious and dangerous. I didn't have time to get a good look at it. It disappeared into the bushes again. Tom was injured in the arm, blood oozing from a deep scratch. "Tom, hold on!" I shouted, helping him up. We realized we had to run. The creature was chasing us, its heavy footsteps and growls getting closer. We raced along the trail, barely dodging branches and roots. The forest was getting darker, and our breathing was becoming more labored. Every moment I expected the creature to catch up with us. Its growling and ragged breathing grew louder, and it seemed it would grab us at any moment. At one point I turned and saw the furious eyes of the creature, burning with hatred and pain. Suddenly the chase stopped. We burst into a small clearing and froze, looking around in fear. The creature had disappeared, as if it had dissolved into the air. I looked around and noticed an amulet hanging on a tree. "That's an amulet," Tom said, breathing heavily. "Such amulets hang around our house and protect it." I realized that something supernatural had saved us, just as it had pursued us. But what was that creature? We couldn't figure it out. I helped Tom into the house and started administering first aid. Samuel wasn't home, and I tried to manage on my own. Fortunately, the wound wasn't too deep, but it still required medical attention. "We need to go to the hospital," I said, examining the wound. Tom nodded, and we quickly got ready. We got into the old pickup and drove to the hospital. The road wasn't long, we could have walked, but I didn't want to strain the injured Tom. The clinic was small, like the town itself. It was a one-story building with faded white paint and a red roof. An old sign hung at the entrance reading, "Medical Center." Rosemary and lavender bushes grew around the clinic, giving the place a special atmosphere of coziness and calm. We parked by the entrance and quickly helped Tom out of the pickup. The doctor, Dr. Drent, was waiting for us at the door. He was middle-aged, with gray hair and kind but tired eyes. His face expressed concern and professionalism. "What happened?" he asked, seeing the blood on Tom's arm. "We were in the forest and some creature attacked us," I began, helping Tom inside. "It was huge, and I'm not sure what it was." Dr. Drent looked at us skeptically. "It was probably a wolf or a wild dog," he said. "The forest is full of dangers. Let me see the wound." We entered a small office where the doctor sat Tom on a couch and began the examination. The room was bright and clean, with walls adorned with nature photographs and medical diplomas. In the corner stood a cabinet with medical instruments and medicines. Dr. Drent carefully cleaned the wound and bandaged it. Then he gave Tom a tetanus shot and some painkillers. "Your wound isn't too deep," said the doctor, "but you need to keep an eye on it to prevent infection. Take these antibiotics and come back in a couple of days for a follow-up." We thanked him and left the clinic. On the way back home, I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Tom looked tired but held up bravely. "We're lucky it wasn't a serious wound," I said, looking at the road ahead. Tom only nodded, lost in his thoughts. When we got home, Samuel met us at the door. He immediately noticed Tom's bandaged arm and became alarmed. "What happened?" he asked, looking at us with concern. "It's okay, Grandpa," Tom replied, trying to reassure him. "Just a small wound. Dr. Harris said it'll heal." Samuel nodded, but his eyes remained worried. We went inside and sat in the kitchen, but we didn't have time to explain anything as Joe burst into the house. He was agitated and out of breath, his face full of extreme concern. "Sam!" he shouted as he stepped inside. "There's an emergency in town! Mark Wilson was attacked by some creature and got injured!" His words hit like a thunderbolt. Tom and I exchanged glances, knowing it was the same creature we had seen in the forest. "What happened?" Samuel quickly asked, moving toward Joe. How is he now? Mark's alive but badly injured. The news spread quickly through the town. Everyone's arming themselves because that creature could be anywhere, Joe said, glancing at us. Some say it's a wolf, others a bear, but no one knows for sure. Samuel said he had to go to town, and we volunteered to go too. Tom and I exchanged looks, understanding we needed to tell the whole truth. On the way to town, moving through the dark forest paths, we began to tell Samuel and Joe everything from the beginning. How we met the Hanson brothers, how they killed the bear, and what we saw afterward. The old man listened carefully, his face growing darker. By the end of the story, he was pale and deeply thoughtful. "It can't be," he muttered under his breath. "If it's really what I think it is." Soon we arrived in town, where a group of armed people had gathered by the town hall. They were talking among themselves, holding rifles and lanterns. The air was filled with tension and fear, people looking around, expecting another attack. We approached the group leader, an elderly man named Sheriff Harris, who was holding a rifle and giving directions. "What's going on here?" Samuel asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Samuel, glad you're here," said the sheriff, nodding. "Mark was attacked by some creature. We don't know what it is, but it's very dangerous. People are scared." We listened to the sheriff, and suddenly the silence of the night was broken by the sound of gunshots. They came from one of the houses near the town hall. Everyone turned in that direction, and at that moment a man started running toward us. I recognized him immediately. It was Bob Hanson. He was covered in blood, his face contorted with fear, and his hands trembling. We ran up to him, and Tom grabbed him by the shoulders, trying to calm him down. "Bob, what happened?" Tom asked, looking him straight in the eyes. At first, he couldn't string two words together, mumbling in fear. His eyes were wide open, and he was barely breathing as if he couldn't believe what had happened. Finally, after a moment, he managed to say, Jim is dead. That creature, it killed him." Everyone around froze, trying to comprehend what they had just heard. After a while, he came to his senses a bit and told us the details. "We were in the house," Bob began, his voice trembling. "And suddenly that creature attacked us. It broke through the window and grabbed Jim, sinking its teeth into his throat. I tried to stop it, but it was too fast and strong. I barely managed to shoot." The sheriff went to the scene with a few people and soon returned, saying the boy's body was missing. People around began to whisper, fear and panic spreading like wildfire. We stood in shock, realizing that the creature not only killed Jim but also took his body. "Everyone stays in their places," Sheriff Harris ordered, raising his hand to get everyone's attention. "We must be ready for any attack. Mike, take a head count. We need to gather everyone here. It's dangerous to be alone in the town." Soon all the residents gathered in the square in front of the town hall, discussing what to do next. Panic and fear hung in the air. Everyone was scared and confused. Suddenly the silence was broken by a terrifying roar coming from the forest. It was the same eerie sound we had heard before, but now it was much closer and louder. At that moment my grandfather Samuel stepped forward. His face was focused but firm. He raised his hand, drawing the attention of everyone gathered. "Listen to me," Samuel said loudly, overriding the noise. "We need to leave here and go to my house. I've hung amulets around it. They will help protect us." People looked at each other, their faces expressing doubt and skepticism. But when the creature roared again, the doubts began to fade. Sheriff Harris, who knew Samuel well and respected his wisdom, made a decision. "All right, Sam," he said, nodding. "We'll rely on you. Everyone listen up. We're heading to Samuel's house. Form a line, armed people on the perimeter, protecting the others. We quickly organized ourselves, with the townspeople carrying weapons standing on the edges of the group, and everyone else in the center. Slowly but steadily, we moved toward Samuel's house. The distance wasn't far, but each step felt like an eternity. Along the way, we heard rustling and movements in the bushes. The creature's roar echoed from the right, then the left, making everyone nervous and glance around. But fortunately, it did not attack. Perhaps it was held back by the crowd and the glow of the lanterns we carried. We moved quickly, trying to keep pace and not scatter. An oppressive silence surrounded us, broken only by our footsteps and occasional breaths. Sometimes it felt like the creature was very close, its sinister eyes hidden in the darkness. We continued our path through the dark forest, surrounded by the eerie sounds of the night. After a while, we saw an amulet hanging on one of the trees, and soon felt that the creature's roar was behind us. People calmed down a bit, realizing we were in the protected zone. When we reached the homestead, the tension began to ease. People settled down, some in the house, some in the garden, trying to catch their breath after the terrifying experience. Everyone knew they needed to decide what to do next. Sheriff Harris, looking over the gathered crowd, stood before us. "I've called for reinforcements," he said, his voice firm but tired. "But we'll have to wait. We need to be prepared for anything. Sam," he turned to my grandfather, "what do you know about this creature?" Samuel sat in the center of the circle formed by the residents and sighed, his face thoughtful and focused. "My people have a legend," he began, his voice deep and serious. "It's been passed down through generations. Once, among the dense northern forests, there lived a boy named Seago. His father had died, and little Seago was not yet able to hunt. Seago's mother remarried a man named Blackhorn, who believed his wife cared more for her son than for him. He decided to get rid of Seago. One day, Blackhorn told his wife that today Seago would go hunting with him. The mother pleaded with him not to take the boy, saying it wasn't his time yet, but she couldn't go against her husband. The hunter and the boy trudged through the impenetrable thicket for a long time. Seago was tired, his moccasins were torn, and his lips were dry, but the grim Blackhorn kept leading him further and further. The sun had already set behind the treetops when they approached the dark entrance of a cave. "Look for rabbits in there," the hunter said. Seago recoiled from the cave, saying he couldn't see anything in there. Blackhorn sneered and pushed the boy into the cave, blocking the entrance with large stones as soon as Seago disappeared into the darkness. Blackhorn thought no one would know where the boy had gone. But a swallow, perched on a tall pine, saw everything and flew to the kind Glooskap. Enraged, Glooskap thrust his spear into the hill that Blackhorn was walking on, and a heap of stones forever buried the man with a serpent's heart. Then wise Glooskap called upon a porcupine and ordered him to save Seago. In the cave, it was cold, and Seago, not hearing Blackhorn's call, stumbled toward the exit. Tears streamed down his face when he heard the quiet voice of the porcupine, who could speak to children. The porcupine said he would help Seago. He tried to push the stones away, but they were too heavy. Then the porcupine called out for help. In response came the wolf, the raccoon, the deer, the rabbit, flocks of birds, the squirrel, and the turtle. All the animals worked tirelessly. The deer left his antler under a boulder, many broke their claws and teeth. But Seago still sat in the darkness. Finally, a bear named Moonsquaw came to the clearing, scattering the stones with her strong paws, and soon Seago emerged into the light. The porcupine asked who would feed the boy, as the animals ate bark and leaves, which were not suitable for Seago. A robin brought a worm, a beaver, a piece of willow bark, and mooing squaw, a blueberry cake, which Seago ate. The porcupine suggested that mooing squaw take the boy in, and so Seago settled in the bear's den. The 3 furry cubs accepted him, and soon Seago forgot his former life among humans, feeling like a bear cub. In the spring, mooing squaw led them to the river, where they feasted on smelt. The bear caught fish, throwing them ashore for the cubs and Seago to eat. One day, mooing squaw sniffed the air and suddenly growled for everyone to run, as she had smelled humans. They hid deep in the den, and Seago learned that humans kill animals, so they must flee at the scent of people. The time for games grew less. The cubs and Seago woke before dawn to gather berries. One day they woke to find everything covered in fluffy white snow, and their winter den became the hollow of a fallen tree. Half the winter had passed, and it was dark, dry, and warm in the den. However, one day native hunters noticed steam rising from the hollow and guessed it was a bear den. Moon Squaw heard the voices of men and woke everyone, saying she would go out first to distract the hunters, and then everyone must run. She asked Seago to plead with the hunters not to kill his little sister. Moon Squaw emerged from the den and ran to the side, but the hunters killed her with arrows. 2 cubs managed to escape into the forest. Seago was the last to crawl out and immediately shouted that he was as human as they were and begged them not to kill the cub. The hunters lowered their bows in fear, and Seago told them his story. The hunters fed the cub and mourned the slain bear. All day, Seago wept over Moon Squaw's body and decided that his name would be Moon Son of the Bear, vowing never to hunt bears. "Perhaps that creature is Seago," the old man added. Everyone listened, captivated by Samuel's story. The silence that enveloped us was filled with fear and anticipation. Sheriff Harris, thoughtfully looking at my grandfather, asked, "So what do we need to do, Sam?" Samuel, after considering the answer for a moment, said, "We need to find the bear's body and bring it to the circle of shamans. There we will perform a ritual to calm the spirit." Everyone held their breath. Listening to this in broad daylight in safety might have seemed like nonsense, but it was night. The firelight danced on faces, and somewhere in the distance, the creature roared. These circumstances gave Samuel's words a sinister reality. Sheriff Harris, decisively nodding, went into the house and soon returned with Bob, who was still shaken by what had happened. "You need to show us where the bear's body is," the sheriff said, looking straight into Bob's eyes. Bob hesitated at first, but then he realized there was no other way. He nodded, and we began to prepare for the journey. Samuel decided to join us despite his age. Tom and I firmly stated that we would go as well. 4 experienced local hunters joined our group. They were armed to the teeth and ready for anything. We quickly gathered our gear, checked our weapons and flashlights, grabbed shovels, and headed into the forest. The road was dark and eerie. The forest seemed alive, its shadows moving and whispering in the wind. Rustling and the sounds of nocturnal animals accompanied us at every step. We moved quickly and quietly, trying not to attract unnecessary attention. We walked several miles, and Bob, tense and on edge, led us to the site. He pointed to a mound covered with dry leaves and branches. "It's under that mound," he said, his voice trembling. We quickly started digging, trying to work as fast as possible. Several people stood guard, weapons ready, listening intently to the sounds of the forest. Soon we uncovered the bear's body. It had begun to decompose, emitting an unpleasant smell that made us nauseous. We carefully placed it on the tarp we had brought. The carcass was incredibly heavy, and I wondered how those 2 had managed to carry it on their own. We hauled the carcass to a place known as the Circle of Shamans. Samuel led the way, showing us the path. Tom, the others, and I carried the body while the sheriff remained vigilant, watching for any signs of danger. We slowly made our way through the forest, each step feeling heavy. Suddenly we heard the familiar roar in the distance, and we realized the creature was approaching. "Faster!" Samuel urged us, not looking back. We quickened our pace despite our exhaustion. Sheriff Harris opened fire, trying to hold the creature back. His shots echoed through the night, giving the impression that the battle was right behind us. "Damn beast!" the sheriff cursed, firing at a shadow flitting between the trees. The roar grew louder, and I felt fear gripping my heart. We pulled the carcass with all our remaining strength, knowing that if we stopped, we'd all die. Finally, we reached the site. The circle of shamans was a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. In the center stood a stone circle, marked with ancient symbols and amulets hanging from the branches. "Place it here," Samuel commanded, pointing to the center of the circle. We carefully laid the bear's body on the ground. The sheriff, breathing heavily, took up a position at the edge of the circle, keeping his weapon ready. "Everyone inside the circle," Samuel ordered. "The amulets will protect us while I perform the ritual." We gathered around, holding our breath. The shaman began the ritual, and the sheriff stopped shooting, remaining alert with his rifle in hand. The old man was in a trance, his voice deep and mesmerizing as he chanted ancient words. A wind rose around us, and we heard whispers and mysterious voices mixed with the sounds of animals. I felt like I was in a trance myself, as if I were between sleep and wakefulness. Suddenly, I saw the creature. It stood outside the circle, staring at us with its furious eyes. The creature was enormous, with long, clawed limbs and black fur shrouded in darkness. Its eyes burned with rage and pain, and in their depths, I saw an insatiable thirst for revenge. Then there was a flash, and a mist enveloped us. I heard a terrifying roar coming from the bear's dead body. The sound made my knees buckle. The roar was piercing, as if it came from the very depths of the earth, and it seemed to penetrate my soul. Then there was silence. Everything calmed down, and the creature disappeared. We stood, holding our breath, realizing that the ritual had worked. Samuel collapsed to his knees, exhausted and drained. We rushed to help him, but he raised his hand to calm us. "It worked," he said, breathing heavily. "The spirit is at peace." We carefully lifted him and helped him stand. The realization that we had managed to deal with this terrible threat brought immense relief. The next morning, when we returned home, the state police had arrived. They surveyed the area but found no trace of the creature. The town gradually calmed down, people returning to their normal lives, but the fear and memory of what had happened lingered for a long time. A week later, I left, returning to my studies and other responsibilities. But Tom later told me that some people still occasionally hear that terrifying roar in the forest. Story 2. We had been advancing along the creek's bank, carefully examining the ground for any traces or items that could shed light on Ethan's disappearance. For a whole week now, we had been searching for my friend and colleague, a national park ranger who vanished during his daily patrol and failed to make contact. As we initiated the search operation, we soon realized the vastness of our park and the daunting task of thoroughly searching it. Other rescue services, as well as friends, relatives, and volunteers, joined us, but so far, it hadn't yielded any results. A sudden rustle in the trees made me instantly raise my head. I recognized it as an eagle struggling to ascend into the air, its wings beating powerfully and causing the branches to sway under its weight. Continuing on, I kept my gaze fixed on the sky until I stumbled, barely maintaining my balance from an imminent fall. Regaining my footing, my eyes suddenly caught something glimmering in the water under the sunlight. Crouching by the bank and rolling up my sleeve, I retrieved a metal badge from the cool stream. With anticipation gripping my heart, I examined it. It was Ethan's badge. This find became a long-awaited breakthrough in our search. Excitedly, I called out to Sarah, who was nearby, and showed her my discovery. Her face lit up with excitement. Finally, after 2 weeks of relentless searching, we found a lead. Immediately contacting our colleagues, I informed them of our location and discovery. Then, together with Sarah, we continued to follow along the creek, winding up the slope. Reasoning that the current might have carried the badge from higher points, we carefully scanned every nook along its banks, hoping to uncover more. Our path soon led us to dense undergrowth, and entering it, we continued along the rushing water. The tree canopies intertwined tightly above us, casting a dim light in which cool silence prevailed, occasionally interrupted by the rustle of leaves. Venturing deeper into the forest, we unexpectedly stumbled upon an ancient Native American burial ground, hidden from the world by dense vegetation. The place seemed frozen in time, with graves engulfed by earth and tree roots. We cautiously made our way among the stone mounds, treading carefully on forgotten paths, when suddenly an astonishing sight greeted our eyes. In the center of the burial ground, in a small clearing, stood an ancient altar. Carved from stone, it was covered in moss and lichen, bearing witness to its unimaginable age. Inscribed symbols and pictograms adorned the altar, their meanings lost to time, but undoubtedly indicating its sacred purpose. Approaching closer, we felt a strange, almost electric tension in the air, as if the place still teemed with ancient energy. I glanced around for clues and noticed something protruding from under the grass. Drawing closer, I realized it was a torn piece of a shirt, identical in color to mine. This discovery alarmed me. I beckoned Sarah, and we decided to continue our search in that direction. As we walked along the trail, we carefully examined every bush, and soon we found a strange track. It resembled a wolf track in some ways, but was sized more like a bear's, although the paw shape was entirely different. What could it be? This find put us on edge, and we began to thoroughly search the surroundings. Here, we found items that apparently belonged to Ethan. However, they were torn to shreds, with traces of blood nearby. We continued our search in hopes of finding at least a body, but found nothing. It was strange. It seemed Ethan was attacked by some animal, but whether he escaped was unclear. We contacted the base and called in specialists. While we awaited their arrival, fog enveloped the area. It was highly unexpected, as specific conditions such as low temperature and evaporation are required for fog formation. It seemed as if someone had activated a smoke machine, and the fog began spreading through the forest. I looked at Sarah. Alarm was evident in her eyes, and I felt out of place myself. Suddenly, we heard some noise among the trees. Due to the fog, visibility was poor, but I distinctly noticed some creature darting past us. I drew my pistol, and Sarah did the same. We stood back to back, trying to understand what surrounded us. Then came clicking sounds, as if a skeleton was clacking its jaws. After that, red lights appeared around us, emerging in pairs. I realized they were glowing eyes. Damn, what's happening? I thought. In all my ranger career, I had never encountered anything like this. The sounds and glowing eyes drew closer, the circle tightening, but suddenly we heard voices to our left. It was the backup we had called for. The lights abruptly dimmed, and the fog began to dissipate. We understood that our colleagues had thwarted the attack. Soon, a man in police uniform approached us, whom I recognized immediately. It was Detective Harris, who worked in our small town. Overall, he was good at his job. Seeing our alarmed faces, he immediately asked, "Hey guys, what's going on? What scared you like this?" We shared the story with him, and he listened attentively, though he couldn't hide his skepticism, noting how hard it was to believe. We didn't try to convince him. The forensic experts began examining the crime scene, cordoning it off with yellow tape. After a couple of hours, they reached a preliminary conclusion. There had been an attack by an unknown animal, but it remained unclear whether the person had survived. We surveyed the area, but no further traces were found. With time still left until evening, we expanded the search radius, but unfortunately, it was fruitless. In the evening, we returned to base, after which I got into my pickup and headed into town. In my pocket lay Ethan's badge. The journey took about half an hour. Exiting the highway, I turned onto a small street lined with neat houses. Pulling up opposite one of them, I got out of the car and climbed the porch. Knocking, I waited. Soon, a young woman emerged with a child in her arms. Her face bore the signs of difficult times. Dark circles under her eyes and a tear-stained face. She was Ethan's wife. When she saw me, hope flickered in her eyes, but upon seeing my somber expression, she bit her lip with pain. "Hey, Jess, how are you? Did you find anything?" She interrupted me without answering. I nodded, pulling the badge from my pocket, and recounted what we had discovered today, expressing the possibility that Ethan might be dead. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she wiped them away with her hand and said, "I don't believe he's dead. I feel he's alive. So don't tell me that again." I apologized to her and said that we would continue the search. After that, I bid her farewell. It was already dark when I decided I needed to clear my head. I headed to the local bar, parked my pickup, and looked around. People were casually discussing their everyday problems. At that moment, I found it hard to relate to them. In the bar, I ordered myself a couple of beers and sat contemplating the day's events. Suddenly, someone sat down next to me. Turning around, I recognized David Harris, the detective I had met earlier. He also ordered a beer. We sat in silence for a couple of minutes, after which David asked, "Listen, about the stuff you told today. Did it really happen, or could it have been a hallucination?" I nodded. "Yeah, it was real unexplainable madness. For the first time in my life, I encountered something like that. Plus, Ethan's mysterious disappearance and the remnants of his clothes. You know, I never really believed in the supernatural, but this time, I even felt like going to church and praying. Understand? When faced with something inexplicable, you start looking for some grain of rationality, but..." David continued, "I believe there's an explanation for everything. You just have to search. I'm sorry about your friend, but someday we'll unravel this mystery." We continued drinking until late at night, immersed in thoughts and discussions about a world that turned out to be much more mysterious and ambiguous than we could have imagined. A phone call woke me up early in the morning. Answering the phone, I heard David's familiar voice. "Good morning, Mike. We've got trouble. Could you come and help?" he asked. I agreed, quickly got dressed, washed up, and without wasting time on breakfast, called a taxi. 20 minutes later, I arrived at the specified address. It was a farm with several police cars already parked outside. Entering, I noticed David and his colleagues talking to, presumably, the farm owner. Spotting me, David motioned for me to join him. Something similar to yesterday's happened here. I'd like you to assess the tracks and listen to the witness, comparing it to what happened yesterday, he said. I nodded in agreement and we approached the farmer. He was a man in his 40s with a thick beard dressed in coveralls. Genuine fear was evident in his eyes. That alone made me worry. The man named Bill began to recount. I woke up to the sound of the dogs barking. Usually they don't just bark for no reason, and when they encounter something unfamiliar, the barking becomes more intense. This time it seemed like they were in a fight. I felt fear, thinking that some animal or stranger might have gotten onto the property. Grabbing my gun, I headed to the yard, which was shrouded in fog. With a flashlight in hand, I tried to light the way, but could see only a few feet ahead. Instinctively, I headed towards the barn, where the dog barking was coming from. As I approached, I heard a plaintive whimper, and then everything went silent. Continuing forward, I looked around for danger when suddenly a pair of eyes lit up to my left, and then another to my right. One by one, multiple glowing eyes appeared around me. After that, I heard clicking sounds. It really scared me. I started backing away, but the circle was closing in. You understand, I was terrified. I fired my gun in all directions, but the eyes started disappearing one by one. After a series of shots, I dropped the gun and ran to the house, managing to close the door behind me. Then something hit it, but I didn't hear any more sounds. Only those same clicking sounds. After that, I called the police, but by the time you arrived, the fog had cleared and I didn't dare go out to check. After hearing Bill's story, it was clear that it perfectly matched mine. Meeting David's gaze, we shared a silent understanding. Then he led me to the scene, prefacing, "When we arrived here and saw what had happened, damn, it really shocked us, and now you'll see it all yourself and understand." Approaching the barn, I discovered a sight that shocked me. Gnawed dog bodies, leaving only bones shining in the sun. But these weren't ancient remains. They were fresh, sun-glinting bones, seemingly meticulously cleaned of skin and flesh. But the scariest part was that they left complete intact skeletons. It seemed as though someone had simply sucked out all the flesh. Around lay the remains of 3 dogs. Nearby, someone exclaimed, "Oh my God, my dogs! What happened to them?" It was Bill. David admitted that he hadn't dared to show the farm owner what had happened earlier. We continued our journey and soon reached the cattle pen, fenced off with wooden beams. Before we entered, David pointed out the tracks, the same huge ones we had found in the park, resembling wolf tracks but much larger, alongside which were numerous small, thin tracks resembling those of birds. After examining them, we entered the pen, where a horrifying sight awaited us. Evidently, there used to be a herd of cows here. I counted about 25, but all that remained of them were skeletons, akin to the fate of the dogs. I glanced at the farm owner, whose face turned completely pale with shock. David approached me and asked, "Do you think it could have been aliens?" Unable to muster the strength to deny it, I replied, "Damn, after seeing everything, you can believe anything." The dog and cow skeletons, left without flesh and hides, created a scene that led to the most incredible hypotheses. "I've already called in specialists," David informed me, surveying the scene. "They should arrive soon. The problem is that such an attack could also happen to humans. We need to take some measures." We both stood there, shocked by what we had seen, when a team of forensic experts arrived and began collecting samples. "Listen, buddy," David turned to me. This is some serious stuff, and it would be great if you could help me with this." "Of course, no problem," I replied. "I'll start my investigation. If similar incidents occur, keep me informed." With that, our conversation ended, and I returned home, then headed to work. There I met Sarah and told her about what had happened. This story truly frightened her. We sat, trying to figure out what it could be, but nothing sensible came to mind. Suddenly, Sarah looked up and said, "I remembered something. We passed by an Indian cemetery at the beginning. Maybe it's somehow connected?" I also recalled it. Indeed, if this is related to something supernatural, this place could play a role, I said. "Perhaps you're right. This week I'll visit my acquaintance in the reservation nearby and ask him more about it." A couple of days passed, during which we tried to find traces of Ethan, but to no avail. The next day I had a planned visit to the reservation, but my plans were disrupted by another call from David. "Hello, hey Mike. You need to come urgently. Something terrible has happened here. It's really a horrific sight. Come to the Green Street area, where concerts and festivals usually take place. It's urgent, Mike. Waiting for you," David said over the phone. I promised to come soon and hung up. Then I noticed that the office was buzzing. Such commotion usually only happened during major incidents. I asked a colleague what had happened, and he informed me about a massive attack at a music festival. Realizing that it was serious, I hurried to the scene. On the way, it was evident that an emergency situation had occurred in the city. Fire trucks and ambulances were rushing in one direction. Upon arriving, I saw a large gathering of service vehicles and many concerned people. Medical personnel were assisting young people who seemed utterly shaken. Passing through the cordon and informing them that I had been summoned by Detective David, I was allowed into the crime scene. The concert venue was cordoned off. Many police officers, forensic experts in protective suits, and other specialists were surveying the area. Approaching, I found David, who was in conversation at that moment. When he saw me, he motioned for me to join him and said, "Damn, this time it's serious. You need to see this." Leading me to the scene of the tragedy, I encountered a horrific sight. Numerous human skeletons lay on the ground without flesh, creating a grim and terrifying atmosphere. David explained to me that a concert had taken place here, gathering many young people. Everyone was having fun, unaware of the looming threat. Suddenly, the venue was engulfed in fog, which initially didn't cause concern. However, soon screams of horror and pain rang out, and panic ensued. Something unknown hiding in the fog began killing people. As he continued to explain the situation, he led me to a group of people sitting, covered in blankets and trembling with fear. The suffocating terror was evident in their eyes. "These are the survivors. We managed to barely get their testimonies," David concluded. Surveying the young people who had survived their worst nightmare, I wondered if they would ever recover from the horror they had experienced. David approached me again and informed me that 25 people had died, and this time, the investigation would involve the Federal Service. The dispatch of a significant number of personnel was expected, as well as the deployment of special forces, and even the possibility of mobilizing the National Guard for searches over an extensive area. "Do you have any theories about what this could be?" he asked me. I shared my thoughts with David about the cemetery and my plan to visit the reservation. "That's a great idea," David agreed. "I'll go with you. Wait for me here for about 20 minutes. I'll finish up with things, and then we'll go together." After some time standing by my pickup, I saw David heading towards me. We got into the car and headed west from the city, where the Indian reservation was located a few miles away. there lived my acquaintance Jack, who held the position of head of the local community. As we approached the reservation, we were greeted by vast untouched lands shrouded in tranquility and silence, against the backdrop of which modern elements sharply contrasted. Signs, small road signs, and modest informational signs telling about the history and culture of the local residents. The landscapes of the reservation were diverse, from lush forests to open spaces with low vegetation, creating a sense of harmony with nature. Driving onto the reservation, we noticed several scattered dwellings throughout its area. These were modest houses, combining both traditional and modern construction techniques. Despite their simplicity, the houses seemed cozy and welcoming. Around the houses, various utility buildings could be seen, as well as small gardens where vegetables and herbs were grown. As we moved through the reservation, we began to notice people going about their daily activities. Some of them stopped to wave at us in a friendly manner. Pulling up to one of the houses located in the heart of the reservation, we parked the car. The house in front of which we parked stood out among the others for its neatness and well-kept appearance. Surrounded by a low fence, it was built of wood, which gave it a warm feel. Around the house, various flowers were blooming, and there were 2 chairs and a small table at the entrance, creating a cozy atmosphere for evening gatherings outdoors. We approached the door and knocked. After a moment, Jack came out to us. He was of average height with a strong and sturdy build, indicating a person accustomed to physical labor. Jack's eyes were dark and penetrating, studying us with curiosity and friendliness. Jack was dressed in the traditional clothing of his people, which included a brightly embroidered shirt and wide trousers adorned with patterns. A band adorned his head, symbolizing his status in the community. Jack invited us inside and led us into the living room, where we comfortably settled on the couch. Within moments, he returned with a tray on which cups of fragrant tea were placed. "It's been a while since we've seen each other, Mike. Tell me, what brings you to my neck of the woods?" he calmly asked, pouring the tea. We shared with him the story of the incidents in the city and mentioned the Indian cemetery. Jack listened attentively and, with a sigh of surprise, remarked, "It really sounds like something supernatural." Then he pondered something. "Tell me, what do you think? Could this be connected to the cemetery? Or perhaps you know some myths on this topic?" I asked him. He paused for a moment, scratching his chin, and replied, "There is one legend that could explain what's happening, although I'm not sure if it's directly related to the cemetery. Just listen." And then he began to tell his story. In ancient times, when the lands were young and the forests were dense among the Indian people, there was a legend of the great wolf spirit, known as Manitou Wanderer. It was said that he roamed the world between the living and the dead, governing the souls of those who had already departed earthly paths. Manitou Wanderer was the guardian of order between the worlds, but his power was dual, just like himself. Once, the world of the living and the world of spirits collided due to a rupture created by human greed and disrespect for nature. This rupture allowed the souls of the dead to return to the world of the living, not for reunion, but for vengeance and chaos. Seeing the destruction caused by this imbalance, Manitou Wanderer decided to intervene to restore order. According to legend, the wolf spirit possessed a powerful amulet made of moonstone and wolf fang. This amulet gave him the power to control the souls of the dead, summoning them and sending them back to the realm of shadows. But Manitou Wanderer knew that direct intervention would alter the natural course of things. So he chose another path. He appealed to the elders of the tribe to gather warriors and shamans to perform a ritual that would restore harmony between the worlds. For 3 days and 3 nights, the tribe gathered around the sacred fire, praying and offering sacrifices to Manitou Wanderer to appease him and restore balance. At the culmination of the ritual, when the moon reached its fullness, Manitou Wanderer appeared before the tribe accompanied by a pack of wolf spirits. The great wolf spirit raised the amulet to the heavens, and its light filled the rift between the worlds, sealing it and sending the souls of the dead back to the realm of shadows, restoring peace and order. Since then, Manitou Wanderer has become a symbol of protection and balance restoration. The legend says that every time harmony between the worlds is disturbed, one should look at the moon, and the glow of the amulet of the great wolf spirit can be seen, reminding of the need for respect for nature and the world of spirits. We absorbed every word of this amazing story attentively. Reflecting on the tale, I couldn't help but think that in many ways, this legend echoes in our events. Perhaps these huge tracks belong to a giant wolf. But then, who left those small prints? I pondered aloud. Turning to Jack, I asked, "What do you think? How can we defeat this creature?" After a moment of thought, he replied, "If this is indeed Manitou, then perhaps the key is the amulet he always carries with him, which emits his power." We immersed ourselves for a moment in reflections on what this amulet could be. But soon realization dawned on me. Here we were in the middle of the day, discussing matters pertaining to the supernatural, and suddenly the atmosphere around us seemed to be filled with a certain mystique, lending everything that was happening a surreal tint. It was truly a strange and unusual feeling. After finishing the tea, we thanked Jack for his hospitality and wisdom, and then headed back to the city. Upon arriving, we found that armed squads had begun to arrive in the city. It was a special forces unit, although it was difficult to say exactly which service it belonged to. David made a call to someone and then asked me to go to the outskirts of the city, where a military camp had already been set up. Surveying the scene spread out before us, I realized that the situation had taken a very serious turn, as significant forces were now involved in resolving the problem. Arriving at the camp, we were directed to the Chief of Staff. He was a typical military man in camouflage uniform with imposing mustaches. He greeted us warmly and asked us to explain all the details of our story. Listening to us, he seemed to hesitate for a moment, and from his facial expression, I understood that he was wavering whether to believe us or not, as our story indeed seemed incredible. Upon completion, he said, "I have taken note of your story, but we will act by the book. We will divide our forces and conduct searches of the forest by sectors." We asked for permission to join one of the groups, and to our surprise, he agreed, considering our affiliation with law enforcement. Summoning one of the commanders, a lieutenant named Smith, he assigned us to his command. The lieutenant nodded in agreement and led us to his men, where we were introduced to the soldiers and provided with the necessary equipment. Soon, the order to move out was given, and we, getting into jeeps, set out on our way. 20 minutes into the journey, we found ourselves at the edge of the forest, where Lieutenant Smith announced that we were to inspect a specific area of the territory. Together with the squad, we entered the dense thickets of the forest, where every step concealed uncertainty. The forest enveloped us in its silence, broken only by the rustle of our footsteps on the fallen leaves and the distant sounds of forest life. The soldiers moved confidently, but there was tension in their movements, as if they expected something unexpected to happen at any moment. Lieutenant Smith occasionally gave commands, regulating the course of the search operations while we tried not to lag behind, looking around. Our path was illuminated only by the rays of the sun, piercing through the dense foliage creating patches of light and shadow on the ground, which added even more mystique to the surrounding landscape. Exploring every clearing, every overgrown corner, we hoped to find some clue or hint. From time to time, the forest would throw false clues at us. Sounds that seemed like footsteps or the rustling of something big made us freeze and strain our hearing. But each time it turned out to be just a figment of our imagination, fueled by our fears. Nevertheless, the further we progressed, the more intrusive became the feeling of an invisible presence, as if the forest were watching us, assessing our actions. But apart from this oppressive feeling, we found no concrete evidence of our purpose. As the sun began to set, it became clear that our searches had not been successful. We had explored the designated square inside and out, but had not found the slightest trace or confirmation of our fears. Considering that we had little time left, I suggested making a short detour and checking out the Indian cemetery. This area was familiar to me, so I confidently pointed in the direction, assuring that we could reach it in just half an hour. After a short deliberation, Lieutenant Smith agreed, and we immediately set off. The hike to the cemetery was quiet, only occasionally interrupted by the rustle of leaves under our feet and the distant sounds of forest life. The surrounding nature seemed to freeze in anticipation, realizing our goal. The landscape gradually changed as we approached the cemetery, becoming more severe and impressive. The trees seemed older, and the air was saturated with the scent of the past and secrets. When we reached the designated spot, the sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in soft sunset hues. Approaching one of the monuments, I noticed on it a worn-out sign in the shape of a crescent, which undoubtedly resembled a wolf's fang. This discovery made me freeze in the realization that this place indeed had a direct connection to the legend of Manitou. I turned to share my discovery with David, but the words froze on my lips when I saw the expressions on the faces of my companions. Everyone around started exchanging frightened glances, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The reason was the slowly spreading fog around us, which seemed to emerge out of nowhere and began to envelop the cemetery, making the surrounding atmosphere even more mystical and ominous. The silence around became almost palpable, interrupted only by our heavy breathing and the beating of our own hearts. Then, in this all-encompassing silence, crackling sounds rang out, causing us to tense even more. At first, they seemed distant and barely perceptible, but with each passing minute they grew louder and clearer, as if the source of the sound was approaching us through the fog. And then, in that flickering darkness, red eyes began to appear. At first one pair, then another, and soon around us through the mist a multitude of red dots menacingly twinkled. They seemed to peer into us, assessing, scrutinizing, causing every cell in our bodies to fill with chilling fear. We stood, petrified with horror, realizing that our encounter with the legend might have been all too real. For a moment, it seemed that time stood still, and the whole world narrowed down to this moment of confrontation with the unknown. In an instant, Lieutenant Smith urgently called for backup over the radio, his voice sounding urgent and alarmed. But before reinforcements could arrive, horrifying silhouettes began to manifest from the dense fog. First came a gigantic humanoid wolf whose imposing figure towered over us. Its fur was as dark as night, eyes glowing with red fire, full of bloodlust and anger. The wolf's powerful paws seemed crafted for destruction, and its razor-sharp fangs looked menacing enough to make the blood run cold in our veins. Following it, skeletal wolves began to materialize from the mist. Their eye sockets glowed with the same red light, and some of them had traces of flesh emerging on their bones, creating a grotesque contrast between the living and the dead. They turned their empty gazes towards us, beginning to growl menacingly. The atmosphere of tension reached its peak when one of the soldiers, unable to withstand the pressure, fired a shot. This shot served as a signal to the start of the skirmish. Wolves, animated by some ancient evil, attacked with unprecedented ferocity. They lunged at the soldiers, their fangs effortlessly piercing through protective gear, sucking the life out of their victims. Cries and moans filled the air, creating a hellish scene on Earth. I fought back, trying to protect myself and my comrades. But the enemy's strength was overwhelming. In that moment of desperate despair, David grabbed me and dragged me down the stream, trying to get us out of harm's way. We ran over slippery rocks, wading through the cold water that lashed at our feet. The sounds of the skirmish gradually faded behind us, but fear continued to drive us forward. We ran, straining every muscle, every nerve, trying to get as far away as possible from the scene of the nightmare unfolding behind us. The forest under our feet quickly gave way to the stream, whose cold waters enveloped our boots, making each step heavier than the last. The air around us was filled with the scent of moisture and earth, which suddenly began to mix with something cold and damp, foreshadowing the approach of the fog. And then we felt the fog thickening behind us like a living creature, eager to engulf us in its embrace. Looking back, we saw dense streams of fog slowly but steadily catching up to us, spreading across the ground like a blanket, concealing the unknown beneath it. The sounds of clicks and rustles grew closer and clearer, filling the air with a sense of imminent danger. These sounds emanating from the fog made our hearts beat even faster, and thoughts of being pursued by something indescribable spurred our steps. We ran with all our might. Each time it seemed that the fog was catching up to us, forcing us to give it our all, discarding all fatigue and fear. Breathing became increasingly difficult. Panic hung in the air, but we continued to move forward, hoping to find shelter, or at least temporary salvation from our invisible pursuers. Continuing our desperate run through the fog-shrouded forest, we suddenly noticed assistance. A group of armed soldiers in full gear swiftly arrived at the scene of the skirmish, quickly and efficiently beginning to surround the area. Their numbers were impressive, and they immediately engaged in combat, creating a new front of resistance before our eyes. In the midst of the new battle, my attention was drawn to a massive wolf, standing out with its power and ferocity. Around its neck hung an amulet, catching my eye with its shimmer even through the veil of mist. Realizing the key role of this amulet, I shouted to the soldiers to focus fire on the wolf and try to sever the amulet. My words found resonance among the commanders, and one of them immediately gave the order. In the next moment, hundreds of bullets flew towards the wolf, but they only glanced off its dark fur, causing no significant harm. The creature seemed invulnerable, indestructible. And then I noticed David seizing the moment, taking aim and waiting for the optimal time to shoot. When David fired, a sharp, piercing click rang out. The amulet around the wolf's neck, as if sensing the impending threat, briefly flashed brighter before shattering into two pieces. When the amulet was shattered, the enormous wolf let out a long, agonizing howl that reverberated throughout the surroundings, sending shivers down even the bravest soldiers' spines. Something incredible began to happen around it. The fog started to dissipate, and the wolf's skeletons, which just moments ago were full of aggression and strength, began to crumble into dust as if their connection to this world had been severed forever. What happened next resembled a slow awakening from a nightmare. Silence descended, only occasionally interrupted by the quiet sounds of the forest returning to its usual life. The soldiers, stunned by what had occurred, gradually lowered the tension until they ceased fire, realizing that the threat had been eliminated. As the smoke of battle cleared and the world around began to regain its familiar outlines, I saw in the place of the massive wolf my friend Ethan, lying unconscious. The shock of seeing my old friend before me was so great that it momentarily paralyzed me. My legs carried me to him, while my heart pounded with both horror and hope. The fear of losing a friend mixed with relief when I finally heard his breathing, weak but steady. Medics, quickly arriving on the scene, took Ethan under their care, providing him with first aid before preparing him for transportation to the hospital. It was difficult for me to look away from the stretcher carrying Ethan. My heart was filled with concern for his condition. It was several days before Ethan regained consciousness. His account of only remembering a strange sensation and the fog made me ponder many things. Local authorities and experts began investigating the incident, trying to understand how Ethan became involved in these events and what exactly led to such an outcome. Following the events, there were long and exhaustive inquiries into Ethan's role in these events. Questions of his guilt or innocence occupied the minds of many, from law enforcement agencies to ordinary citizens. People wanted to understand how an ordinary person could become the central figure in such an incredible story. The investigation tried to unravel the complex situation, gathering witness testimonies, analyzing all available evidence, and trying to link Ethan to the ancient legend of the Manitou. Supernatural experts and researchers from different parts of the country came to give their assessment of what was happening. While some saw Ethan as a victim of circumstances in the wrong place at the wrong time, others were convinced of his involvement in summoning entities from the otherworldly realm. Debates about whether Ethan possessed any unknown abilities or became an unwitting instrument in the hands of ancient forces raged on. Ethan himself, gradually recovering from his ordeal, found himself in the spotlight, trying to answer questions for which he himself could not find explanations. His life was turned upside down, and he felt the weight of others' expectations and suspicions. Ultimately, despite all the inquiries and debates, no compelling evidence of Ethan's guilt was found. The story involving him remained shrouded in mystery, and questions about what really happened that night remained unanswered. Over time, interest in the case waned, but for those who had faced the inexplicable firsthand, these events would forever serve as a reminder that the world is full of mysteries, answers to which we may never find.